in the south, southeast and southwest by the Indian Sea. But it is not only a South Asian country, it also is a South Asian country, it also is a South Asian country. What I wanted to show with this part over here, because not many people are aware that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are a very important part of Southeast Asia, just a few miles away from the Strait of Malacca, just a few miles away from Indonesia, and of course also from Thailand and from Myanmar. And insofar, the strategic situation certainly is an extraordinary one. And if you go further on and look what is important, then you can see here this long red line going from the Red Sea through the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. This is more or less the lifeline for Europe, for the Arab countries, for South Asia, for Southeast Asia, and for East Asia. This is the reason, because almost all the trade between those global regions goes over here. That, of course, we have this Belt and Road strategy from China. But also you can see, you know, if you take this way and take at the same time the Pakistan corridor and the Myanmar corridor, that India is almost encircled by Chinese interests, being an immediate neighbor in the north, but also having heavy interests in the west, in the east, and in the south. And this, of course, is very important also for the future constellation. This is also the reason why India in the last years tried to establish also, or to take part at the so-called quadrilateral security dialogue together with Australia and Japan, and also America, although the relations with America used not to be very intense in former periods. And if we now look, you know, try to look to the future, you have here more or less the population curves of China and of India. It is prognosticated by United Nations, and you can look over here, I mean, beginning with 2020, this year or last year, it was for the first time that India had a higher population than China. And the really interesting thing is, you know, that of course India's curve still will increase, whereas China's curve will decrease. And for the end of the century, the prognosis is that India probably will have almost double the population of China. India with round about 1.5 billion, and China with round about between 700 and 800 million. And of course, this will change not only economy, but also political importance and insofar, you can say not only the geostrategic positioning of India, but also the demographic development certainly will be a very important factor. If we look at the next picture, you can see this is a GDP projection by Pricewaterhouse for the period until 2050. And you can see the red line, this is China. This is not the GDP for the exchange rate, but you only can do it for the future, of course, with purchase power projection. And you can see, you know, that it is, of course, still a certain time, but round about in the 2040s, India will cross the line even with America and become more or less one of the three giants also in economic terms, at least as far as we can predict it from nowadays, okay? If we look to the situation now, this is a map of the BRICS. You can see, you know, that India is not only in competition with China, but also in some organizations together with China, with other countries, developing countries, and the BRICS certainly, by their enlargement, have won on importance, and it certainly is very important also that those countries sit together at one table and try to resolve their problems. In Europe, especially now with the Ukrainian war, there sometimes is a certain surprise that India still is keeping its very good relations with Russia. But if you look to the map, you know, you can see why this did not only happen in the past, but also will happen in the future. In the past, there is a historic strong relationship between India and Russia. And also in the future, you can predict that there will be a very strong relationship. Why? Because if you look to the three giants, the three Asian giants, Russia, China, and India, you can see Russia and India are very important, but they do not have a common border, but both of them do have a common border with China, and therefore it is very natural that they will try also to look at their interests, their common interests in this relationship. Okay, let me go to the last picture. What will be the geostrategic priority for India? If you look to the geostrategic situation, you can say that it will be, of course, everything that we call more or less the global south. It will be especially the region around the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific Ocean, which means big parts of Africa, the Arab Peninsula, Southeast Asia, but also, of course, some countries in Latin America. And insofar, you can more or less predict that sooner or later, India will take a very important place in world politics due to its geostrategic position. Of course, it will have and will be confronted with many challenges because the demographic increase is not only a stronghold, but of course also quite some challenge, especially in the moment. But I mean, if you look back to the development in the last years, you can say that India certainly will have the capability also to master this problem. And in this way, I want to finish now and try to hand over to the ambassador. Before I ask him to come here and start his keynote speech, maybe just a few words to his person. First of all, you know, when you meet him in Austria, you are surprised about the way this perfect German language he's speaking. But this is not such a surprise, because he has quite some diplomatic experience. He was in Asia, he was in Kathmandu, he was in South Africa, and he was twice also in Germany, in Berlin and in Frankfurt, and he really has learned his German language in a perfect way. But he also used to be ambassador in Morocco, at the Philippines, and now in Austria. And this is now the moment where I want to hand over and just once again want to welcome you very heartily. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faslavand, for that very insightful overview and your assessment of India. Thank you very much to you and to the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and the Diplomatic Academy for your invitation. And it's good to see all of you here today, despite a cold Vienna evening, to share some thoughts and ideas on India's global role. And I'm going to try and approach this topic in three interrelated sort of sections. Firstly, I'd like to make some general observations about India's contemporary situation. Thereafter, some general remarks about the current global scenario, and thereafter, maybe in a sense, link some of India's approaches to what is happening both within India and without. On India, as is fairly well known and was mentioned here, we are today the world's largest country in terms of population. And more importantly, I think the Indian population is a young one, with a median age of, in 2024, a median age of 28.4 years, which essentially means that more than half of India's 1.42 billion people are less than 28.4 years old. And over a quarter of Indians are actually are in the age group 0 to 14. So this is really a very young population. And equally importantly, and this needs to be said, the economic, health, and educational indicators of this population have been the best they have ever been and are getting better. India is thus not just a young country, but a more prosperous, healthy, and achievement-oriented society. Another key aspect of India is its democracy. It's not just the world's largest, but we believe that India's democracy is deeply embedded in our civilizational ethos. And as all of you would have seen, earlier this year, we had a remarkable exercise in electoral democracy, the world's largest and most complex exercise. And even the other day, I was watching some memes about the American election where they said, you know, India has 1 billion votes and they counted it in one day, and why is it still not being counted, all the votes in the US? It is a model of governmental and societal efficiency. And from the parliament in Delhi to the panchayats in the villages, we have, I would say, a very deep democratic spirit that permeates India. And this is not just in terms of the well-off citizens, but it is a democracy that works for our women, for our youth, and for sections of society that have been socially less privileged in the past. The third element which I want to highlight, which was mentioned in passing, is our economy. Today, the world's fifth largest, and hopefully by 2027, the world's third largest economy. More importantly, we are growing faster than any G20 economy, consistently. And the aspiration is that we should be able to double our GDP from about $3.5 trillion today to about more than $7.5 trillion by 2031. In other words, India's average GDP growth of each year is broadly about will be about $400 billion, which is more or less in the range of what I think Austria's overall GDP is. So this is really a reflection of the scale. And in fact, the interesting thing there is that it is estimated that 20% of all global growth in the next decade will be in India. Another significant aspect of this growth engine, that is India's economy, is that it's primarily domestic demand driven. And unlike some of the other economies that have grown basically by expanding their exports, India's growth is powered by domestic demand. And that has very serious implications in terms of how we see things. And our GDP export ratio is only about 20%, including goods and services. And this, I think, is a very big differentiator. So together, these 3 Ds, as Prime Minister Modi says, democracy, demography, and demand, are a critical enabler of India's global positioning and India's own growth. And I want to add a 4th D, if I may, and that is digital. And if you see, India is really at the forefront of the global digital economy. From the software services boom of the early 2000s, today our companies have become essential partners in digital transformation worldwide. There are over 1,600 global capability centers. These are so-called because this is where most of the R&D happens, are in India. And we're not talking about simple IT anymore. We're talking about AI, machine learning, cloud computing, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, etc. And this is mirrored within India by very successful progress on digital governance, driving forward financial inclusion, speedy delivery of government services, transparency, and probity in government. And with over 100 unicorns, we have a very vibrant innovation ecosystem. And this ecosystem is linked in terms of its linkages with the larger global knowledge ecosystem. Let me now shift the frame of reference and make a few comments on the current global situation. I don't intend to brief this audience about recent developments, but let me try and draw some trend lines, if I may, just so that we can discuss more about what India is doing. The first trend line, I would say, is that broader public participation in politics, driven by the social media, has created pressures on the political leadership everywhere. This is both a positive impact, because as a democracy, greater involvement of people in the democratic and public discourse is a positive, but it also creates certain challenges that all of you are well aware of. Second, geopolitics is back. After about, I would say, 2.5, 3 decades, when we were thinking that maybe geopolitics is a thing of the past, I think serious contestation between powers is now a reality of the modern international landscape. And we are witnessing this contestation not merely in geographical terms, but also in very, very serious functional domains, like technology, or critical minerals, for example. And you can see that manifested in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, and of course in Europe, which you are very aware of. Third, COVID was a serious shock to international structures. It exposed some fault lines, some new ones, and made some old ones even more visible. Think about how long some of the African countries had to wait to get vaccines, and you understand what I'm trying to drive at. But more profoundly, it has forced a rethink on international supply chains and how production is organized and regulated. It has brought in the element of trust and shared values into economics, moving away from a non-political, if you will, discourse on globalization to a more nuanced and more politically aware approach towards how economics is structured. And this, I feel, will obviously produce winners and some losers. And this is a process that is currently underway. Four, irrespective of your ideology or interests, some issues necessitate global cooperation. Not cooperating in the broader global context is not really an option for any country or group of countries. you think about the climate change crisis, you think about the need to bring about equitable economic development, both within societies and between societies in larger global context. We need to work together as a global community. And there is no alternative but to engage with that process. And this global conversation has to operate on some ground rules. There is currently, of course, a lot of debate about what those ground rules are, should be, but the fact is that there is a broad understanding that these ground rules have to apply for this conversation to go forward. And in my personal view, these calls will grow louder, and all states, organizations, and even corporates have to show that they are adhering to these ground rules. One last point about the global situation is that fundamentals still matter. Peace, diplomacy, and dialogue are not merely slogans. They are key to making progress on all major issues of our day. Responsible behavior is central, especially for powerful countries whose actions impact everyone. Humanitarian support, relief for disasters, and other longer-term measures to build capacities and resilience across geographies will have to be prioritized, irrespective of who is having that conversation. Now, to move on, after those broad comments on what one sees as key trend lines in the global situation, what does India do? What role can India play? And what are we doing already? Here again, I don't want to get into a long discussion. I'm sure that there will be more conversations around. But let me just make a few summary observations so that we can discuss further. Firstly, as 1/6 of the world's population community, a strong, growing, and democratic India is automatically a factor for stability and economic development worldwide. India's success underlines that economic transformation is not just possible, but better done in a democratic framework. And I think this is a very important point that needs to be stressed, because there have been arguments that democracies and development don't necessarily go together, especially in the developing world. India's pace may have been slower, but I would argue that it is more inclusive, more ecologically sustainable, and will likely be more durable than any non-democratic alternative. Second, India is and it will be a global powerhouse of talent, which will drive our digital and knowledge future. The success of the global capability centers I mentioned, but you look at Indian professionals abroad, and in fact, the very mobility that the modern economy is driving will make this more and more likely. And India's markets and India's growth, as I mentioned, are opportunities for all countries to exploit. Thirdly, geopolitically speaking, India is part of the solution, and we are definitely not part of the problem. We have sought to maintain ties with all countries and in multiple frameworks. And we are currently one of the few countries with the ability to speak to all countries, to all parties, and to help with channels of communication where needed. And we've shown that we're willing to do so in as much as the parties concerned wish us to engage, and often even beyond that. And we recognize that solutions have to be found at the negotiating table and not on the battlefield. As Prime Minister said, this is not an era of war. Fourth, India will continue to champion the interests of our fellow developing countries. The changes in the global order cannot lead to a scenario where the less developed countries again have to pay the price. From our vaccine Maitri, vaccine friendship during COVID, to our humanitarian assistance and disaster relief activities from the Pacific to East Africa, we have been helping in emergencies. We will continue to assist our developing country friends in building capacities through programs such as our iTech, which have trained more than 100,000 public professionals in the past few decades. And we hope that our cost-effective and need-appropriate technologies, especially what we've achieved with digital public infrastructure, can be scaled up and taken to the rest of the world. And we feel that the developing countries can benefit from this digital transformation. Lastly, India will both support the global good and contribute what we can to address our shared challenges. Even as the world is struggling to find answers to the climate crisis, India has unveiled one of the most ambitious renewable energy programs. We have already created nearly 200,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity, with the increase from 2022 to 2023 alone is around 14% in installed capacity. And we strongly support initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the Lifestyle for Environment, and so many other initiatives to try and create a sustainable future. Yes, we would like to see early and decisive changes to international structures, such as the United Nations and its Security Council. And we would like to see these mechanisms that are there, multilateral mechanisms, gain momentum, such as we did during our presidency of the G20 last year. And since we are in Vienna, one of the capitals of multilateral dialogue, we hope to see a multilateralism that allows more space for developing countries and for their development. Before I conclude, I should say a few words about the India-Austria partnership. I'll be very brief. I think we are at a point of decisive progress. We had a very successful visit by Prime Minister Modi in July. The political dialogue at the highest level underlined very great similarities in our approaches to global issues, and our perspectives have a good match. And there are excellent synergies, I would say, in terms of the economic and technological partnership that we can build. Austrian tech meets Indian scale and spurs shared innovation. And there is much to report on this, but I think that is the subject for another discussion, which we hope to have later. Thank you very much, and once again, for being here.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd also like to welcome you tonight to our discussion on India's global role in my role as the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and start with thanking Ambassador Kumaran for your excellent introductory remarks, for giving us a broad insight into India's foreign policy in the time of a global challenging environment. And also special thanks to President Faslam, the president of our institute, the AIES, for your introduction, for showing us your very illuminating slides to give us also a better understanding of these current developments. You have mentioned the underestimated, even underappreciated role maybe of India in Europe. And in preparation for my introduction today in my role as a moderator, I have very briefly been taking a look and researched the India's perception, the perception of the Indian people on this increased geopolitical relevance and role of India. And I think that there is more awareness and more confidence of the Indian people. And let me just show and share with you a couple of numbers. Yeah? Over 60% of respondents in a recent survey stated that India's global status has increased and risen since President Modi assumed office in 2014. And the same poll also said that most Indians believed that the country had progressed to promote its cultural capital, its status as a world leader, but also its attraction for tourists, but also foreign investors. And in February 2024, another poll also suggested that 9% of all participants in that survey responded that President Modi will be remembered first and foremost for his contribution to raising India's global stature in the world. And in addition to that, 33% of Indians also believe that India is the most influential country in Asia. So we see here that this underappreciated role or perception in Europe is certainly not shared with the Indian population. However, we will have the chance to discuss the topic of India's global role in depth with two excellent speakers tonight, and this is why I would like to welcome our two speakers to join me here on stage. Unfortunately, Ms. Shirin Nassar could not join us due to personal reasons, but I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Christian Wagner, Senior Fellow. Dr. Wagner is Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Your area of expertise includes Asia, security and defense policy in general, but your focus is on India's foreign policy, its democratic change, minority conflicts, and your recent publications, amongst others, include India's SDGs between nationalism and development, the foreign trade agreement between EU and India-Taiwan relations. Maybe we can also have some time to go into the details of your recent publications. And secondly, Richard Ghiasy from Leiden University, the Asian Center. Thank you very much. Richard, your research focus lies on Asian geopolitics and geoeconomics, but also revolving around the relationship between China and India, EU's strategic interest in Asia, and you have provided policy advice to the European External Action Service, the European Commission, and the OSCE, amongst others. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here with us, for sharing your insight. I would like to start with you, Christian Wagner. Maybe you can give us your perspectives, your insights on this question of India's global role, maybe also in a more regional setting. Has it indeed been as progressive, as forthcoming as we have heard in the previous statements?
Yeah, dear Michael, first let me thank you and the Institute very much for the wonderful invitation coming back to Vienna. It's always a pleasure to be here. When you look at India's regional or global role and you focus a little bit more on the region, it's interesting to see a certain discrepancy between a region which is the immediate neighborhood on the one hand, which is South Asia, including countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, the immediate neighbors, and the larger region, which is, as was mentioned, the Indo-Pacific. And unfortunately for India, at the moment, in its immediate neighborhood, it's encircled what my Indian colleagues would probably call not so friendly governments. So we have seen government changes in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, where my Indian colleagues are a little bit skeptical, seeing this is really a challenge. Much has to do at the same time with China's growing relevance in the region. China has always been an important player in the region, but since the mid-2010s with BRI coming up, we have seen this massive investment in many countries of South Asia, also with some negative consequences. So this has led to a situation where you can say India has lost at least some of its influence in South Asia. The picture is totally different when you look at the Indo-Pacific, as was pointed out. India's growing engagement in the Indo-Pacific, its growing cooperation within Quad, both on this minilateral format, but also on the bilateral relationship. India has a very strong economic and political cooperation with countries of Southeast Asia. It also has intensified its relation with the Middle East and with Central Asia. So you see a very divergent picture that within the immediate neighborhood, the situation is much more complex, much more difficult, whereas on a broader, let's say, regional focus, looking at the Indo-Pacific, ranging from east coast of Africa all the way to Japan and the South Pacific island, India has certainly gained a lot of reputation and important in recent years.
Can we probably dive just a little into why you believe this is the case? Why do you see this discrepancy taking shape?
Well, at the end, it all boils down to the same answer: China. On the one hand, China's growing importance within the region. All the smaller countries had problems with India, and India had problems with its smaller neighbors. All countries have a long tradition of playing the China card or some other great power. But with China now investing so heavily, this has created more challenges for India. So you can make the point that India has lost a lot of its relevance. But China is also the most decisive factor when you look at the wider Indo-Pacific region. Quad is an institution which does not have an outspoken military component, but it's quite clear that Quad is intended to act as a counterweight, as a counterbalance towards the Belt and Road Initiative and vis-à-vis China. So in that sense, the other countries in the Indo-Pacific see India as a counterbalancing force. The smaller neighboring countries also have their own kind of problems with India, so they look, of course, for China and other great powers as a counterbalance to India.
So would it be too simple to say that this discrepancy is also a manifestation of the challenges and the rivalry between China and India?
Yes. I mean, at the end, we have this long-standing rivalry. Situation has improved since the last SEO summit, but I think it will take a long time coming back to normal. On the other hand, the interesting point is that India is also economically dependent on China. So a lot of India's growth story also depends to a great extent on China, and there is some debate in how far the recent rapprochement was also due to the fact that many Indian companies have argued vis-à-vis their government, saying we need better relations with China if we want to keep up our economic growth. We need the economic cooperation with China, whereas, of course, you have a bilateral problem, you have a very tense situation on the border, you have an unresolved border conflict, you have a regional rivalry. So on the geopolitical, on the geo-economic side, there is a lot of rivalry, but on the bilateral relationship, there's a great dependence on China in India. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can also step in and ask you for your remarks, Richard, and your comments on several aspects that we've heard already before. Can you give us also some introductory thoughts?
Sure, and thank you, Michael. Thank you to the three hosts. Wonderful to be back in Vienna, surely one of the world's great cities. And it's wonderful also to see fantastic turnout here, our audience, and surely also online. I'd like to commend the hosts, and indeed the audience as well, because I think the focus of the topic tonight is very timely, for sure, but also because I generally think that here in Europe we still lack in interest in, awareness of, and also expertise of, Christian and others exempt, as it relates to India, India's past, India's strategic culture, but also contemporary India. It's there but I would argue not amply, and the synergies among the EU member states, I think at the moment is far too little. So an event such as this surely helps, very timely indeed. My argument tonight is that we, including here Austria in the geographic heart of Europe, should celebrate India's re-emergence, the global stage, and in a more global role. I have three arguments in mind to support that. The first is that it's mostly for moralistic and humanistic reasons. India has been said home to about 1/5 of humanity. So if 1/5 of humanity does not do well, I would argue it's quite fair to say we generally as humanity don't do well. If you take into consideration that about max a third of the world's nations mostly have the wealth of the globe, or another statistic, for instance, that 70% of women worldwide still do the laundry manually, the emergence of this 20% is absolutely critical. It's also critical, I think, because I think Mr. Ambassador referred to it as a democracy. The US, of course, is the world's oldest continuous democracy, is probably at the moment, after what we've seen in the last few years, not the role model it used to be. India is the world's largest, and indeed, it's embedded very deeply, culturally, the embracement of plurality. If democracy in a kaleidoscope of ethnicities, languages, different spiritual traditions in India does well, it is phenomenal PR and marketing for all the proponents of democracy. The other and second argument is in the interest of multipolarity. Multipolarity in Asia, multipolarity globally. We focus on Asia for now. One could argue that, well, we have multipolarity. There's ASEAN, there's Japan, Russia, if you like, China, of course, for sure, US as an offshore balancer. But within that multipolarity, some would argue, well, we have a certain dominance of bipolarity, that of China, if you will, China plus Russia to some extent, and the US and its allies. And so India, an increasingly powerful third pole, if you will, but otherwise contributing to that multipolarity, in my opinion, is a positive. Some realists might argue that the more dyads you have, so basically the more major great powers competing with each other, the greater the risk of conflict, misunderstanding, competition. Perhaps, but the alternative, hypothetically speaking, is a unipolar China-led Asia, very hypothetic, or indeed the dynamic we have now, the competition that is here to stay between China and the US, so a more bipolar nature. My third argument, and perhaps the most important one, is, we're not talking about any actor when we speak of India. We have to remember, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is one of the world's great civilizations. I think there's no denial. We might overlook it. We might forget it here in the West. If you want to go by Huntington, one of the great five, it certainly fits. I think it fits in any categorization. It's also a civilization which millennia old that we generally associate with wisdom, and that has excelled some of the pinnacles of humankind in the arts, in the literature, and also in spiritual traditions. Of course, it's the birthplace of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. It's the birthplace of Mahabhira, of the Buddha, of Kabir, of more recently Ramana Maharshi. India's contribution from a metaphysical, spiritual perspective is quite unparalleled. I think as a civilization, the only one that might come close actually in that regard is China. We also need to be cognizant of the fact that India, our perspectives at least here of India as a nation state that perhaps has been a little less economically developed in our recent history, was not always a fact. As a matter of fact, from the birth of Christ to around the year 1820, India and China nearly consistently were the world's two largest economic powers. Of course, India's fortune changed, not for the better, when the Brits took over. And of course, you could do the math. After those roughly 200 years, India had turned from one of the richest to indeed economically one of the poorest. And it's also quite remarkable how, despite that chapter, India seems to harbor very little resentment. I think India's re-emergence, and I guess you'll notice I like to stress the re-emergence. It's not an emergence like they haven't been here. Always been there. So that re-emergence, I think, is also very important because they're going to be bringing along, I think we're already witnessing that, new interpretations of international relations, of cooperation. Peace, dialogue, inclusivity at the table was mentioned, prioritized over the battlefield, for instance. India speaks of one earth, one family, one future. I mean, truth be told, we here in Europe never mentioned the world as one family. Neither has the US. And if you then consider that, of course, India, together with China, I would argue, can be considered as one of the two leaders of the global South, such principles, such thinking, including on security, cooperative security, for instance, these nations that will, I think, increasingly look up to India, they're probably going to be infused by these new interpretations and prioritizations. I think at the global stage, it's a very potentially positive development. Now, of course, I think as Dr. Faisal Benz also mentioned in his presentation, it's going to take a while before India is able to exert that level of influence economically, geopolitically, in its values, but normally speaking, it's a matter of time. And so, in sum, I would argue that, generally speaking, can't predict the future on the turns and twists of Indian foreign and security policy, but by and large, I think we should indeed rejoice India's return, India's more global role. But I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that India will be doing this on its own terms, and it will be doing what it thinks it's best for itself and for the world, without necessarily aligning with any of us. And who could blame it? So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for also your remarks. I think is very interesting and relevant because when talking about India's global role or India's regional role, maybe most of us would not have expected that element, that argument of also looking at the civilization, this more philosophical or spiritual aspect. But I'd like to use the time that we have left to indeed go into some sort of a discussion. I know, Christian, you've noted down a couple of points. Maybe would you like to comment, or would you like to give us also your 2 cents with regards to what we've just heard from Richard?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Richard, for your remarks. Let me somehow also, not as a sort of a counterpoint, also for the entertainment of the audience tonight. Yes, you can argue on the re-emergence of India. My standard argument is normally when I look at India to do expectation management. For the simple reason, when you work too long on India and the subcontinent, you have heard too many discussions too often. So this is why I'm become a little bit more cautious. And there are some figures, for instance, some of the figures we saw, India now the largest country in the world. Countries want to be on number 1 in many international statistics. That's fair. If you want to be necessarily the largest one is a very critical point. We have heard some of the points about the demographic dividend, but it also comes with huge responsibilities. So it's not clear whether the demographic dividend will really come or whether it will turn into bigger problems for the country. So this is why I think one has to look at the different facets that India represents, both on the domestic front as well as on the international front, to get a better view. And we have seen in the recent elections that one of the main reasons why Mr. Modi did not gain for the 3rd time an absolute majority for his own party, he's still in power and he still has a majority, yes, was because of the problem of unemployment. So you have high growth rates, yes, which is the good news. The not so good news is that you have many economists who argue that's the minimum growth rate the Indians needed. Normally, India should grow at a pace of 8 to 10% for at least a decade to come in order to cope with China. And that's the challenge for India in the years to come, to keep up these high growth rates, and of course to have to create an adequate number of jobs for this youth population, because only then the demographic dividend will really come. So this is why I normally make the point about expectation management. Yes, India has enormous potential, that's not the point, but I think the government also has to do a lot of domestic reforms. Yes, the figures or the challenges are well known, in order to make this potential then really work, and also to make it work on the global level. We should not forget, India is, of course, the fastest growing G20 country, yes. At the same time, it's also, unfortunately, the poorest among the G20 members. So, and when you look at per capita income, India is a lower middle income country, which shows you that if you want to play a bigger role on the global stage, you have to invest more. So the economic development will be the biggest challenge, because only if India will be able to catch up with China, and that's an enormous challenge, then you can really, or then we can really argue that India will be able to play the role that the decision makers of the country have always aspired for their own country. Thank you.
Of course, it's very difficult always to make predictions on the future, and we all don't have, of course, a perfectly working crystal ball, but maybe you can just tell us a couple of factors, a couple of indicators that you personally would see as key elements to look at to answer the question whether or not India is indeed able to seize this potential? What are the key indicators that you're observing?
I have 3. Jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the 3 most important key indicators. If the Indian government or if the Indian society and state is not able to really set up or to really create these jobs, then you run into a problem. At the moment, for instance, one of the biggest challenges is the lag in manufacturing jobs. India mostly has its jobs in the service sector, and you have a huge debate now coming up. Will it be possible to have this rise of India only with the service sector? We have no historical experience so far that this is going to work, but that's not necessarily the problem, because it could also work in the case of India. We don't know. But it seems to be better on the safe side to have more jobs in the manufacturing sector. And if that's not going to happen, then it will become much, much more difficult.
Richard, do you agree with that? Is it jobs, jobs, jobs? Is there something else that you personally look at as an indicator?
I fully agree with Christian. Of course, the ecology of jobs revolves around health facilities, education, of course. So it is quite an ecology, a wide and deep ecology that India needs to work on hard. For sure, India is not there yet, but neither is China, by the way. India in particular, I think, has quite a long way to go, even if it's just for the sheer size of its population. Of course, considering the size of that population, for a very long time, per capita, it will remain the lowest numerically among the G20 or among the lowest, but it, of course, also applies to China. But by and large, the structural trends, I would argue, for now, are positive. The fact that it is world's 5th largest economy, projected to be the 3rd largest in about 4 years or so, or shortly after. The fact that geopolitically, generally, it's a very favorable time for India, from Japan to the US to us here, the receptiveness, engage with them also as an alternative market to China. I think the synergy of factors, all very positive. But yes, I would like to reiterate that the Indian authorities have a massive challenge at hand in indeed tapping the talent of that very young population, making sure that dividend is indeed a dividend and doesn't potentially become a burden.
Ladies and gentlemen from the audience, I know that some of you might have questions already, so I'll open the floor for the first round of Q&A session. The gentleman here in the 2nd row. Yes, we have a microphone for you. Just give us a second.
I mean, a few words fell. Europe underappreciated India, then India and China. And I spent 35 years in the US, and I have a viewpoint of India and China. The United States, for the last 40 years, picked the best brains out of India, and were able, with these brains, to maintain a technological advantage. We, for instance, I worked for a technical company with 10,000 engineers in Pune, so does Microsoft, etc. We don't see that from Europe. And when we outsourced to India, intellectually. We outsourced to China manufacturing. It's basically labor, and that's the difference between India. Yeah. India has a good school system. There's no language barrier. China has a language barrier, typically. The question is, what's the issue with Europe? It seems like Europe missed the boat for the last 30 years to stay technologically advanced, to take advantage of that education system in India, of basically, I don't want to say cheap engineers. The rates were very cheap in the 80s, now they're higher. But in the US, we have all the way to CEOs, Indian engineers. Yeah. And we don't see that in Europe.
Yeah.
And I think we're losing out because of that.
It's a good question, the role of Europe in general, but especially also in the tech field. We have one more gentleman here in the back. Yes?
My name is Günther Fehlinger. My question is about the I was very optimistic actually about the free trade agreement between the European Union and India until basically the start of the war in Ukraine. And now, sadly, unfortunately, India has chosen the Russian side. And that's very negatively surprising now for me. And I wonder why that is. And also the question then concretely, when you see that President Trump has basically now threatened 100% tariffs for all the countries who support the BRICS currency, and Prime Minister Modi was in Russia now at the BRICS summit in Kazan recently, and he has celebrated this BRICS currency. Is it not time for Europe also to join this movement for 100% tariffs against all the BRICS countries until they really choose the side of Ukraine and freedom against genocide? And please, India, come back to us, come back to the free world.
Thank you. And there's a gentleman here also in the center. We will have time for one more round of questions, but was there a question from here, from the, yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Almar Suleymanov. I'm a graduate student of the Diplomatic Academy, and the problem and issue I would like to raise is the issue of brain drain and the brand of the country. In 21st century, it's not enough just to be a biggest country by population or by economic growth. It's also how the world sees you, how people, especially young people, tries to enter your country. And what we see, the brightest brains of India, Indian communities, they have successfully established businesses that are working in favor of the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries. And my question in this regard is there any potential of not only Indians remaining, the best Indian minds remaining in India and working for India, but also people from, let's say, Europe, United States, Canada, Australia to move to India to work in their favor as well, because that's I guess the focal point in this question as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's answer these questions first, and then we'll have a second round of questions. Christian, I'd like to start probably also with you, because as I mentioned in my brief introduction, you have researched the FTA between EU and India. Can we pick your brain on your takes?
Thank you very much for the questions and comments. The first one on the role of
EU.
Yeah,
and in the tech industry.
Yeah, the tech industry. There are also a lot of German companies who are heavily investing in India, especially in the field of tech. So I think we have, maybe the Europeans have been a little bit late, but when you look at big German and other European tech companies, I think you can go to Bangalore and you would find a lot of them there. On the FTA, the point is not so much that India has joined the Russian camp now and will abandon Europe. That's not the point. Europe is important for India's modernization. India needs Europe in the economic realm. We also need India on the, especially in Germany. Just a couple of months ago, German government has signed a mobility and migration agreement with India, so we are going to recruit more Indian skilled labor for the German labor market. So I think it's not the point that India somehow did a trade-off between Russia and the EU. That's not the point. These are two different camps. Of course, Prime Minister Modi so far has spoken for a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. He has not criticized the Russian aggression against Ukraine so far. So in that sense, I think there is still a lot of scope for the EU-India free trade agreement. Now we had elections in the EU, we had elections in India. I think negotiations are going to be restarted. Of course, there is a debate, and you have, when you followed the recent visit of German Economic Minister Habeck in India, where he made a remark that the challenge is also on the EU side, because the EU normally wants to negotiate very comprehensive free trade agreements, which include some bitter pills for the Indian government, which finds it extremely difficult to sign clauses on sustainability or labor standard and other things. So I think the negotiations will continue. It will be extremely difficult. It will be slow. I think an agreement is necessary, because from a geopolitical point, failure is not an option for both sides, because keep in mind, it's the second time that EU and India are negotiating such a free trade agreement. So there is a certain, I would say, political pressure on both sides to really bring this to a successful conclusion. On the brain drain, yes, when you rightly pointed out, all the talented Indians leave the country to set up their business. It shows you the difficult business environment in India, it seems, for Indian companies. What we see, as I've just pointed to, is that you have European companies coming, trying to get access to the talent pool of the country. Manufacturing is still slow. We are now seeing more German companies trying to go to India. German companies trying to diversify their risk, trying to leave China and set up their business in other Asian countries. India is one destination. It's not the only destination. So which brings us back to the question, what about reforms? And India is, of course, then in a competition when companies move out of China, want to go to other destinations. India is in a competition also with Southeast Asian countries. Mm-hmm. So this is why you have the phenomenon that normally, it points to the fact, or what I've started, or what I said earlier, it's all about jobs, jobs, jobs. So the moment you would have better domestic situation in India, more Indians would probably stay at home and get better positions in the domestic labor market.
Mm-hmm. Richard, some of your remarks on these questions as well. Would you like to comment?
Absolutely.
What Christian has said? Yeah, please.
Sure, and the question specifically as well. On the EU, somewhat shifting our focus from India to the EU, falling behind in tech in particular. Absolutely, we've already fallen behind. I mean, if you look at tech, soft and hard, it's virtually entirely US dominated, and when it's not the US, it's China, including in most of the world's next-gen technologies. If you take away perhaps Dutch ASML, German SAP, handful of others, and also looking at more traditional industries, by the way, car manufacturing challenges, we are at risk, or perhaps we're already there, of this beautiful continent and garden being a nice nursing home where tourists come and take pictures, but where most of the tech indeed is designed and developed by mostly the US, China, and indeed, looking down the road, it's very conceivable that India will be that third major actor in tech. I think it's highly conceivable. But India is not, in my opinion, a solution to our tech woes. Of course, there are synergies of scale, cooperation, talent, these issues that we've discussed, but ultimately the problem lies here in Europe, a very serious problem indeed. I think on the EU-Indian FTA, it's been going on for quite a while, for sure. I think the link with Russian side, I fully side here with Christian as well. India has not opted to side with Russia, plain and simple, except they don't want to condemn the invasion to the extent that we here are. And for some reason, who could blame them? We need to look at the history here as well. India's had very good relations with the Soviet Union, with Russia for most of the last few decades. And in those decades, the US led West in India's most difficult moments did actually not side with India, did not support India. So why should India necessarily now side with the position that we here in the West take on Russia? Brain drain, I think, was the last question. I think you may have heard it, you know, better some brain than no brain, right? As in, the Indian diaspora has done remarkably well overseas, especially if you actually compare that to a lot of Asian, Chinese Americans, for instance. A lot of the MNCs in the US, for instance, not with us here in Europe remarkably, but in the US are actually headed by Indian citizens or citizens with an Indian background. They've done remarkably well. That talent, that network, that expertise, they can take back home as well. The diaspora that is educated outside of India, of course, as well, the experiences they get, the knowledge, I think that is all indeed priceless. And probably, you even see it in DC, in political DC, how American citizens with an Indian background do extraordinarily well. Probably no other diaspora has done as well in that context in the US as India has. Now, for sure, and it goes back to the point that we've discussed earlier and that Christian's made about jobs, and to which I added in the jobs and education. For sure, the Indian authorities need to work on that hard as well, to educate their young, bright, talented population, but also to employ them. But the fact that others, some of them might want to venture overseas, I think that'll stay, right? As long as we have that possibility, for sure. You see that among Chinese, by the way, as well. Finally, if I may, just because I think the gentleman in the back also made a remark about the tariffs and Trump and the 100%. Of course, if he were to do that in his administration, with so many nations, massive inflation for the US, it's a good bargaining position to begin with. I'm not sure if it's quite conceivable, but we need to realize that a lot of these actors in the non-West, India included, China for sure, and others, they're not really content anymore with the dollar hegemony because of the unilateral sanctions, the cutoffs from, for instance, the SWIFT system. And so whether Trump to some degree might, discourage this direction of a lesser dependence on the US dollar hegemony, by and large, I don't think it's a tide that he can stop. There are way too many actors who want to see differently.
We have time for one last round of questions. The gentleman here in the third row.
My question would fit to the earlier batch questions, and I'm citing to my foreign minister. He says that Europe problems are for the world problems, but the world problems are not for the Europe. How are the European leaders looking at this, and how are the European leaders looking at the leadership of India in this global growth? Thank you.
Professor, please.
One comment and one question. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Yes, demography is bright for India, but it's a window of opportunity. In reality, it means 1 million jobs per month, to create 1 million jobs per month. How is that possible? Adding to that, billions of dollars go into high-tech evolution in India, and not in small jobs for people coming out of farms, land laborers, and so on. So we have 580 million workable peoples. We have only 5 million people in the famous IT industry. This is my comment. And the question is, the never-ending story, India-China. I call it the cold peace. for many reasons. What is India going to do against the Silk Road advancements of China all over the world? And how will India be able to get a permanent seat in the United Nations as long as the Chinese are fighting totally against it?
And Mr. Krauchenberg?
Thank you very much indeed. Krauchenberg Institute of the Danube Region, Central Europe. As BRICS was mentioned, we all know that the driving forces of BRICS are China and Russia, and they are cooperating very closely. So I just wonder if India should put all its eggs in one basket, the BRICS basket. Another thing is when you're traveling in India, which is fascinating, absolutely, but there is certainly a problem of infrastructure, as everybody knows, not only in the cities but also countryside. How could you get better in this, because it requires enormous amount of money. And the regional policy, there are challenges. I mean, China was mentioned, thinking at the Maldives, for instance, even in the neighborhood, immediate neighborhood of India, there is a Chinese challenge also in the political field. Thank you.
And if I may, I'll just add one last question, because Russia has been mentioned a couple of times. I think it has been already confirmed that in the beginning of 2025, President Putin will be visiting India for the first time since the Russia-Ukraine war started in 2022. Can you probably also briefly comment on your expectations of this visit and what you believe might come out of it? Richard, would you like to start this time?
Sure, Michael, thank you. I think the gentleman who referred to, I think Minister of Foreign Affairs Jaishankar, was it Davos, was it elsewhere, where he indeed said Europe's problems are not necessarily anymore the world's problems, correct? I think he's right. I think we here, of course, we here in Europe in particular have been in a very privileged position since 1492, and especially in the last 2.5 centuries. But that very Eurocentric view and era, whether we like it or not, for better or worse, wherever you stand, the reality is the centrism of that is over. Sitting on top of that pyramid is over, and increasingly we need to be sharing it. And increasingly, indeed, if we're not careful, and referring back to the question about technology and our position in that, if we're not careful, we're going to have to probably take a few steps down. It's not something I favor at all, but it's not an unrealistic scenario. So I think when the remark was made by Dr. Jaishankar, it was very accurate, and I think even the audience there and the moderator, they were taken aback because it was very frank. It was perhaps a bit of a wake-up call, not bad in that sense. I think Hans, 1 million jobs per month that need to be created. Indeed, statistically, most of the Indian labor force actually still works in and on the field. And Indian formal small, medium enterprises, formal, especially medium, could definitely use a boost. Of course, creating a bit of a better balance between the large conglomerates, fairly often family-run, family-controlled, with indeed smaller structures. That is a massive challenge. I think you're also referring to the Sino-Indian relationship, Cold Peace. By and large, I would argue, Asia is large enough for both of them to be stable, content, prosperous, and safe. They've lived side by side, although those borders were barely ever as direct as they are now, direct borders, for millennia. There's no reason why, considering their wisdom, their priorities, they couldn't continue to do that. And I think the relationship will sometimes be warmer, pre-2020, a little colder 2020 now, but as you know better than I do, at least it seems to be recalibrating a little. On the UN Security Council, fully agree. I mean, it is ludicrous that the African Union, India, ASEAN, a number of other actors are not represented there. China, of course, like India, speaks of inclusivity, of shared future for, they call it mankind, I would call it humankind. And if they really favor that inclusivity and the whole notion of indivisible security, then for sure, they should be welcoming India as well. Of course, the whole dynamic of the P5 is problematic, and the problem is not just China, in my opinion. Otherwise, if I may quickly, I think the BRICS, the gentleman behind Hans, I would argue, and perhaps Christian has different views, but I wouldn't say that India is putting all its eggs in the BRICS basket. The BRICS, of course, roughly 40 countries have lined up to join them. That's quite a feat. But aside of that, India is basically involved in any real multilateral body, whether it's more Asia-centric, such as the SCO, a bit more BRICS or others, or SARC, if you will, but also beyond that. Quad was, for instance, mentioned. So from my perspective, they're actually branching out, AIB, in a lot of organizations, wanting to be in rather than out, seeing the agenda, partaking, perhaps even reflect on the agenda, shape the agenda, but not necessarily restricted to the BRICS, in my opinion. Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. Perhaps when Christian said jobs, 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 I should have responded with infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. That is the bedrock of development. Any nation that is successfully developed, including Austria, there's no exception in the world, has invested massively in infrastructure. And if I could fault anything, and with the current administration, it's a lack of focus on more infrastructure. I think Mr. Ambassador mentioned a few stats indeed, including power generation, renewable, etc. But in my opinion, much more needs to be done for sure. And I hope they'll take notice. I keep it at that. And
Christian, some
yes,
final remarks from your side, answering most of the questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure is also the latest buzzword in Germany, as you may know. So we are also in this group. Professor Niesel made the point: what is India doing on China and India relations, the Cold Peace, and how is India reacting to China's Belt and Road Initiative? India has started to cooperate with other major powers, with the United States, for instance. To increase connectivity in South Asia. India is also promoting its own kind of connectivity projects, the International North-South Transport Corridor, together with Iran and Russia. Also a new initiative, the IMEC project, which is India, the Middle East, and Europe. Also, and you have also some maybe not so successful projects like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. So the Indians at least try to develop their own strategies, whether it's in cooperation with other great powers or on a multilateral level. To improve in infrastructure brings us back to the question how, and that's of course with foreign direct investment, and this of course then brings us back to the debate in how far is India really opening up its economy. This is, or being not so open, and of course that's part of the struggle you can say you have within the Indian business community. The final point on Mr. Putin visiting India, I think it will also be an interesting test case for India-US relations. Because in general, we will also see President Trump taking over. I think it's important to keep in mind that India, or we have a debate in especially Western circles, in how far India can, as it was mentioned before by one gentleman, will switch side following the Western camp. I think India is not likely to do this. It's the same, or it's very similar to BRICS. India is not putting all its eggs in one basket. It's a long continuity in Indian foreign policy to have as many eggs in as many baskets as possible. And for India, what is important is not only to have a multipolar world, it's also important to have a multipolar Asia. And what is a multipolar Asia? A multipolar Asia consists at least of 3 countries. One, of course, is India. Who else? Second is China. And who's the third one? And the third one is not Japan, it's not South Korea, and it's not Indonesia, it's Russia. So for the Indian perspective, having Russia in the game is always a very important task. And this makes it extremely difficult. And I think we have some, I would say, misperception here in Western circles, because we think we can bring India on our side, where I would say that's not in the rationale of the Indian government. Because they need a multipolar Asia, because when it's not a multipolar Asia, it's a unipolar Asia. And a unipolar Asia is China, China, China. And that's certainly not in the interest of any Indian government. So in that sense, I think it will be again a tightrope walk for the Indian government, because the visit will bring new projects, and it will be interesting to see in what kind of projects, and how far will these projects be seen to support Russian war efforts in Ukraine or not. But I think cooperation between India and Russia will continue, and that's one rationale of any Indian government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that one of the key elements, the takeaways for me personally, also coming from the think tank perspective, is that we can certainly agree we need more expertise, knowledge, awareness on India. This is certainly something that we will also, as the AIES, contribute to. I would like to thank both of you for your excellent input, for your remarks, for also challenging us here in this discussion tonight, especially also to the audience for being with us, to the Embassy of India here in Austria, also for co-hosting and co-organizing this event, which was for 2024 the last event that the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy will host here at the Diplomatic Academy. We have one more event, as Dr. Fassler-Abend has mentioned, this week at the America House on Disinformation on Thursday. And then we'll be back here at the Diplomatic Academy on the 20th of January, when we will be talking about Trump 2.0 and NATO versus EU security and what the impact of the US will be. So please already save the 20th of January in your calendars. And I would like to also invite you for a small reception, a glass of wine in the room next door, to also have a continued discussion amongst each other, but also with our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we have a group photo? Can we have a group photo? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we have a group photo?